Welcome to Brands on Tap, the podcast where we discuss all things brand related.
So whether you're a business owner, industry expert, or simply interested, this podcast is for you.
Hi guys, this week we're going to be talking about what is typography and why does it matter. So we're going to basically cover all things type. So it's going to be different types of typography, uses of typography, where you may see typography in everyday life or in branding or in design. And basically just kind of our angle on how we see type and how we use it day to day, really.
Yeah. So so it's an overview of typography basically. And we're, as an agency, we're extremely passionate about the use of typography and the good use of type. So we'll just dive a bit deeper into typography.
Yeah. So to begin with, there's a good place to start is essentially the podcast. What is typography? So for us, typography is the use of a font face or a typeface, if you like, that's going to convey a message, or it's going to help a design or a publication basically communicate to the audience in a more effective way, essentially. So rather than just seeing type as text on a page or as letters, essentially for us type is much more than that, and it's more of a design choice. It's more of a style choice for each and every client and work that we do, essentially. So within that, there's different types of fonts and types. So you've got sans serif, which is essentially old type would have had serif points on it to help identify letter forms and to help legibility. As modern times became kind of more and more aware of that, typography got more streamlined. So we have sans serif fonts. So we have the letter forms that are the serifs removed. So essentially you've got much cleaner letters, and that tends to be more modern in terms of where you see that.
Yeah,
so,
you typically see like for instance, like the Times newspaper that uses a serif font. So you've got little tails basically on the extremities of each letter.
Yes.
So normally like little curved elements. And that's generally what you can tell the difference between a serif and a sans serif. The sans serif basically hasn't got any of that. Very clean on the edges, no little flourishes at the ends of the extremities or anything like that. So that's the main difference between the two.
Exactly. And as you connotated to earlier with typewriters as well, obviously the older typewriters, as you're typing on those, the letters that came through those are quite iconic. People can recognize them pretty clearly, but they would have those kind of subtle little serifs on them. And I think that would be a very, from a generational point of view, that would be a very kind of generic typeface that's now connotated as typewriter font.
Yeah.
Back then would have been, in the typewriter era, would have been seen a lot. And there would have been a lot less choice in terms of what people were choosing when they're writing letters or when they're writing factual statements or documentation or whatever. It would have nearly always have come through in that same way.
As a typewriter.
Yeah.
Back in my day,
in your day when you started. Yeah, exactly. But it's quite interesting that, I think, because there would have been so many publications, documents, written collateral back then that would have been done on typewriters that people wouldn't even thought twice about a font choice or how it looks or what they're actually doing, that the design element was almost irrelevant.
That's right.
It was a factual document, whereas nowadays you've got that ability, even with factual documents, to choose a typeface, to lay it out, to make it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, to choose how you want it to be displayed.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite interesting. So we're talking about different types of fonts and typography. Styles in essence, but it's also being aware of the generations of how types changed and how sort of more modern type is generally serif adverse. So there's more sans serif fonts that you see generally.
Having said that though, I mean there are quite a few brands now that are using serif purposely.
Absolutely. You're right.
Really it's quite a nice font if you've got a market brand, let's say. You want to, like, it's quite prestigious and luxury, then that's generally where you tend to see, even still, and this, as time's gone on, you've still got slamming doors.
Still got slamming doors, yeah.
Yeah. You still got brands that use a serif font predominantly all the time. Like off the top of my head, thinking Mercedes-Benz, for instance.
You're right. Yeah.
The main headline font for Mercedes-Benz is a serif font, and it has continued to be ever since I've known the brand, which is a little while.
Yeah, 1830.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
So there has been like sort of trend changes, but there are still cohorts of brands that retain the use
you're right.
of either sans serif or serif, infinitum, basically because it's part of their brand DNA, I guess.
You're right. Yeah, I suppose I was coming at it more from when I was leading on from typewriters and body text and letters. I suppose I was meaning more body text in general publications, books, that kind of stuff. Certainly when I was growing up and using textbooks or books at school, it was nearly always sans serif in there, which connotated kind of more modern publication versus an older book that you'd come across and it would be a serif font, or it would be written, like you say, like the Times would do, to create that kind of classic feel.
Yeah.
And I suppose you're absolutely right that from a branding point of view, serif is now very current and very trendy.
It is.
And if the right font exists, and there are so many of them now, which is a beauty of the ability to create fonts, which is much easier now. Adapt fonts, change font styles. We've got that luxury of being able to pick from so many different styles of fonts.
Yeah.
That serif is no longer connotation of old fonts. It's definitely something that can be so varied.
Yeah.
It can look really contemporary now as well.
Yeah, serif tends to look classier, I think.
Yeah.
Depending on the usage, and obviously depending on the brand as well, as we touched on.
100%.
So,
yeah.
And then that's kind of evolved into, I guess slab fonts have been around for quite a while, but in a way it's very similar to a serif font. But instead of having very sort of curved edges on a serif font, you've got very sort of block edges. Similar to a typewriter style, actually.
It is
in that way.
You're right.
But yeah, it is a slab font. You find a lot of builders, merchants, and people like that tend to use a slab font. We also see a lot of charities tend to use it because there's a crossover between a sans serif font, which looks quite modern, and then you've got a serif font that looks quite traditional and classy, and the slab font kind of bridges the gap between the two quite nicely.
True. Yeah.
So you tend to see it with charities and things like that.
Yeah, that's true. And again, with these kind of categories of fonts, where we've discussed like slab fonts, sans serif fonts, and obviously script fonts, which you've not got onto yet.
Nope.
But those are categories of types of styles of fonts and typefaces. So although there's so many out there now, and you could get lost if you didn't know one from the other, you could get quite lost in which one you need to pick and which is the right style and appropriate style for your brand. There are still, interestingly, very limited amounts of categories that they would fall into. So they are stylized in one of those core fundamental categories, which again, I think someone that's not particularly font savvy would maybe appreciate quite how much that is quite limited.
Yeah.
So script fonts, what's the deal with them?
Well, I think script fonts, obviously, as the name suggests, it is like a script, like a scribing. So you tend to find brands that use a script font, normally either in a logo design or even in a headline font, want to come across as a bit sort of friendly. You can obviously design your own font and script style for a logo design, let's say, which we've done before. And so you can get that unique element. It almost looks like a signature, really. So you have that kind of unique style. And like Rob touched on, there are literally thousands now of script style fonts out there for you to choose from. But that's generally, it's more for sort of brands that want to come across as approachable, friendly, fun, that style of thing. But there are more sort of contemporary looking script fonts out there now. So you find brands that kind of want to bridge the gap maybe between a sans serif font or a slab font are now kind of leaning more towards a script style font, but is not too freehand. It
Interesting.
looks a bit more uniform,
Yeah,
and that can come across quite well too.
that's a really good point, because sometimes you, again, certainly if I asked people of a certain generation what a script font was, I think they'd connotate, a calligraphic type written fountain pen
Yeah,
type font. And I think that can, again, like we discussed with serif and sans serif, I think there is a generation of difference in script alone. So you've got that very classic script font, or
definitely.
like you say, you've got more modern script fonts which are intentionally trying to be sort of more handwriting-y,
Yeah,
or in our instance we've used with fostering that can come across quite childlike but still very professional.
yeah,
Because I think you've hit the nail on the head when you said some people that we've encountered ourselves have tried to handwrite fonts, and that's a really interesting point when we're discussing typography and fonts, is that consistency of the letter forms.
yeah,
So even in a scripted font, you would expect every letter form to be consistent. The last thing you'd want is it to look so handwritten that every letter is very different from the
yeah,
other, and it would create a very unprofessional look and feel for that brand.
yeah,
So although again somebody looking at that might think, oh, it looks handwritten or is handwritten, the actual detail in there is no, every letter looks the same.
yeah,
It's just you've not noticed that it's quite cleverly done, so it
yeah,
looks quite handwritten, but professionally and from a branding point of view, that consistency is still there.
definitely. Yeah, I mean, we use and have used script fonts, as you touched on, with fostering clients that we do work for, and others. Some of these new modern script fonts come with, it's a word that we've not touched on yet, but they come with a load of glyphs.
Mm.
Um, and the glyphs basically are different variants of the same letter.
Yeah.
So, for instance, I mean, we're using a font
Hmm.
at the moment. It comes with three, well, actually, no, I think it comes with about five different options
Yeah, I think it
for
does.
a lot of the vowels, let's say. So some have got more swirls and swishes in, some are a bit more sort of classical, almost leaning towards a sans serif type style. And so, you can select as a designer what type of glyph you want to use. If you want more flourishes and things like that
Yeah.
with that script font, you can then select that one. Um, that does it can cause a few problems though when we're talking about using these fonts, say on web, and we've got to instruct when building the website what glyph set to use, because sometimes, especially when you're handing a website over to a client, let's say,
Yes.
and they want to create their own headlines and things like that, if we don't put in the right glyph set, then potentially there's flourishes and things that might happen in a headline, let's say, that might look a complete mess. So there are nuances and things that you need to be aware of
Yeah.
when selecting glyphs and characters within type online.
Yeah, you're right. It's a really good point about glyphs, I think. Again, like where you've got a more embellished font, sometimes the glyphs can go quite wild and be quite out of hand, can't they? So we've done some designs where you've almost got these kind of swooshes, like you've said, and swirls, but you've also got the embellishments of the letters. So you've got you could use brackets, you could use all different types of characters that they make
Yeah,
custom embellishments for, so that you can essentially create almost like a typographic execution with a consistency that all suits the font style that font author decided to add in.
yeah, yeah,
And that could be anything from a range of, like you say, a tail on an E to a whole flourish
yeah,
that kind of encapsulates the font. And we've dealt with that in the past, where you've got more stylized fonts, like you say. We've done it with other fostering agencies as well. We've done it with various charities we've worked with, where the font itself comes with an arsenal of essentially shapes and letter forms,
yeah,
to the extent these days where you can even create fonts from icons,
yeah,
from SVG icons, which is a graphic, scalable vector graphic. So what that allows you on the web is this infinite flexibility to have icons that are represented by letters or type that are very easy to use, very accessible, and very consistently
yeah,
sized.
yeah,
So that, leading on from Paul's point on glyphs, I think that's a really interesting point to bear in mind as well, from modern
yeah,
type and how
yeah,
flexible it can be. and how much you can do with it. But yeah, you're right. We've learned the hard way that we've had to set some quite hard rules with some of the fonts we've picked in terms of the spacing and the glyph choice. But the luxury is that those kind of options are available today. So if you are building websites, you can set those kind of options, even to the extent of how, if you've got an L next to a W, how that spacing between those letters, how that's treated compared to, say, a H against an I, which is going to be a very different treatment. And it's subtle things, but that consistency across setting that across the typeface, across the web, and print for that matter, but it's the fact that the option's there now. I think that creates that level of professionalism which you can really refine. So I think that's kind of covered the majority of things, like where you'd use sans serif, where you'd use serif, what scripts are about, and the slab side of typography. And again, each one could be used in different ways and different treatments. You could combine them, which is something we haven't mentioned yet as well. So sometimes you would combine, they don't have to be alienated. Sometimes you would combine, say a serif font with a sans serif font, depending what they are. You could have a title in the serif font, and then the body copy could be sans serif.
Rarely do you have it the other way round.
That's very true. Yeah, that is true.
It's mainly a serif font for, like you said, is a heading, and a sans serif font because especially on smaller type, it's more legible to read a sans serif font in that regard.
You're right.
The other thing is that there are, like Rob touched on earlier, there are literally thousands of typefaces out there, and we follow type designers because it's an area that we're very passionate about. So we follow type designers and font foundries as well to look at trends and new styles of type, and even the usage of type as well. So we're very hot on looking at trends with that as well. Several go-to places, Behance, for instance, Adobe Behance. You can have a look on there. So if you're really interested in type, if you key in typography into that, quite often it will bring up a plethora of type designers basically, and typefaces that some of these type designers have created, and how they've used them, and we find that really insightful, and we love looking at stuff like that, because ultimately for our clients we're trying to create collateral that is engaging, and type is a massive part of that.
100%. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think there's sort of standard type faces and fonts that people have become accustomed to over the last sort of few generations, where we've seen them pre-installed on machines.
Well, like Comic Sans, you mean?
Like Comic Sans is a big favourite of ours. Yeah, try and use that wherever possible. But as you say, that there is the irony of that is Comic Sans is seen as a very legible font because of the way it's written, but aesthetically, it's awful, really, for want of a better word. I don't think any designer would disagree with me on that. But as we've seen from consultations with accessibility experts and people that understand type forms, lettering like that looks slightly handwritten, certain people with issues identifying letter forms can relate more to that, because I suppose it looks slightly more hand drawn. So it for them it resonates a little bit more with how the letter would look on a page or on paper. So I can understand that, but I think for us, like you say, understanding the variety of fonts, the use of fonts, the impact of fonts is our job as creative agency to make sure we understand that for clients. And using things like Arial and Times New Roman, although they're installed on your computer, if we'd used Helvetica at uni, our work wouldn't have been marked, because it was just seen as something that was installed on the machine, and you haven't put any thought into why you've chosen it. And I think that's really important. So that's where we would always consider what type's being used, why it's being used, and what the font is. Whereas somebody else perhaps might think, oh, Arial, that will do, it's on the machine, it looks clean, it works, but it's what it's saying about your brand. And if it's saying you're generic, you've gone with something that's quite plain, everyone's got it on their computer, is that really what you want reflecting your brand image? And I think that's where you've got to be very careful in what you pick and what you choose.
I mean, there are instances obviously where if you're, especially with email templates, let's say, there are, a set list of typefaces that
Yes,
are
very
kind of
good point.
approved, that can be read across, different email clients such as Outlook. So yeah, that's where kind of specific typefaces, you might not even be able to use your brand font typeface.
No, that's a really
In
good
that
point.
instance, you might end up having to use Verdana or Arial or
Yeah,
something similar.
yeah,
But I mean, you touched on like Helvetica a minute ago. I mean, a lot of the typefaces that we see now are still derivatives from typefaces like Helvetica
absolutely.
on the sans serif front, and say Times New Roman on the serif font side of things. So over time you see various iterations, but they are quite often just plays on well, historic typefaces that have been around for probably 100 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, time is changed, and some of the new fonts coming out now, we see new fonts all the time, and they look, some amazing fonts out there.
Yeah.
So like Rob said, don't be fixed to what's in your type set suite within, say, Word or whatever. Have a look at font foundries. Even looking at Google Fonts, for instance, and Adobe Fonts, there are, instead of the standard ones, there are lots of other alternatives as well in there that you can use.
There are.
But there are numerous other font foundries out there. You just do a Google search and you'll find that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, even with the kind of influences, you've got the kind of the Swiss influence of Bauhaus. You've got the kind of contrast like you get with Bodoni, so you've got a very thick lines against thinner lines with different font types, and I think those started those trends, and now you can see so many different fonts and typefaces that have been influenced by that. Certainly from, we regularly use like Swiss influence fonts, and you think there's such a limitation to that because of the fact that it's, a very clean edge, a very sort of recognizable style, but yet there's so much variety. Even the subtlest change in the ligatures on, say, a Swiss style font can make so much difference, and there's so many out there.
Ligatures. What's ligatures?
Yeah, exactly. We've not even touched on that yet. So yeah, essentially, that's what I was trying to get across, is the fact that each letter form or ligature, like Paul said, which essentially is going to be the actual markings that are imprinted basically from the type.
Yeah.
So Paul, you'll regularly change type letters, type forms. If we've got a font, say even like we've compared it to Arial, that's quite plain, quite bland looking, if you're using it in a brand instance, you might want to tweak something in it to have a nod to that
Yeah.
particular brand, or you might want to refine some of the kind of the way it's leveling, the way the elevation of the letters sit next to each other,
Yeah.
the angles of the tails, anything like that can subtly can create quite a big impact.
Yeah.
And essentially, that's you editing the little ligatures, which is the actual elements of the font, to create that refined look and feel.
Yeah.
And it could be even something very subtle, like even the microphone stands we've got Shure, they've pulled the tail of the R down, and it's the rest of the letters are quite uniform, but the R, that tail has come through, and it just creates that brand style that perhaps another brand that has used the same font or a similar font hasn't done.
Yeah.
So it's created that unique element, that unique nod to that brand in
Yeah.
essence.
Yeah. I mean, that is a very good point. That creating unique type, you tend to see it more so in logo design,
Yeah.
where people are have played around with the ligatures, the spacing, which we'll come on to in a minute, and yeah, just the general type treatment. So instead of just using a standard font as is out the box, they change it, change little elements of it.
Yeah.
And it creates then a unique identity for that brand. So yeah, playing with type is something that we love doing, especially when we're creating logo designs. Very rarely do we use a font just straight out of the box. I'm not saying we haven't done it. I think we might have done it once or twice, but we generally, we'll tweak the type even if it's, as I say, just tweaking the spacing of the letters, or playing around with the ligatures and things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, like you say, an example of a very stylized brand would be something like Disney, probably, where they've gone way above and beyond to create a very recognizable set of letters, if you like, that will, potentially stand the test of time.
Wasn't that based on his signature?
It was originally. Yeah, it
but
was.
obviously it's been tweaked since.
Yeah, it's been refined, and again, even if they subtly refined it every sort of decade, the chances are people wouldn't notice that much to kind of go, wow, they've rebranded. It would just be a very subtle tweak, which I think is quite common with quite a few brands. They'll do very subtle refinements on, say, a typeface or on a ligature or something, which maybe the average person wouldn't even notice, but over time you can kind of clean that brand up. Definitely. And make it move with the times. Yeah. But I think that's a really good example of where something's quite stylized, whereas something like, say, we were talking about sans serif earlier, something like BBC, they've kept that very clean sans serif approach, but they've made it work for them over the decades. They've changed it enough that it's still relevant and it's still very recognizable, but they've kept that nod to where they were and where they came from, and I think that's really clever because they've not deviated from that initial impression they wanted to create. They've managed to stand by their guns and said, this is what we were, and we kind of still are. We're still represented. That still represents us, but we've maybe moved with the times slightly. We've changed slightly. And I think that's a really clever thing. And we've spoken about, other brands like Apple doing a similar thing, where they've kept the consistency of the motif, but they've changed the typography. I mean, from where they started, from that sort of serif-y style Apple, they changed very quickly to a sans serif, and they've kept that clean sans serif for decades.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody remembers the Think Different campaign.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's donkey's years old now, but that was all, all the type for that was in a sans serif font. Oh, sorry, a serif font.
Yes.
And like you say, now is a serif font and or sans serif font. I want to get my serifs and my sans serifs mixed up now.
Serif dyslexia,
yeah. Let's just talk about slab fonts, shall we?
Yeah, no, I get the same thing. It's funny. No, you're absolutely right. I think that, the message to take home from that is the fact that they adjusted quite quickly, I think, because of who they were initially to who they could see themselves. And again, they've stuck by that brand. And I think that's really impressive to see when you've got like we said with BBC, you've got that subtle refinement, but the main letter forms are still very similar to what they were before. We've spoken about editing ligatures. You've got the likes of kind of FedEx that we both really admire, where they've created that kind of negative arrow shape in affecting the ligatures of the letters. Yeah. And again, that's timeless for them. They probably won't ever need to change that.
Yeah, I think the arrow appears in between the E and the X. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I used to do design work for FedEx back when I worked in Australia, which is long time ago. And I was, so that logo, I mean, it's still been around, still around now. And I was working with that logo, 25 years ago or more. So that is a classic case of where, a logo's been designed using fantastic typography that was current then, and it's still current today. So I don't know how many brands out there have kept exactly the same type or very similar type.
No, same.
And stood the test of time. I mean, if anybody out there knows of other brands that have used the same type style in their logo design and haven't changed that for the last 25, 30 years, I'll be interested to know. Put some information in the comments.
It is really interesting, because there's obviously like trends, fashions, design styles. Like with clothing and music and everything else, it changes quite regularly. It does come back around, like we're seeing again with clothing and music, it comes back. But to have that same identity and make it work with different styles, different aesthetics, that is really quite impressive and quite clever. And you can't probably say to somebody they're going to be absolutely confident when they choose that they know it's going to work, because there's no way of predicting how things are going to go from that trend. But I think that's one safe bet we can say is, unlike a serif, a sans serif, because of the fact it's come in and people are aware of it, it's more likely to stand the test of time now than, say, a serif that's got that connotation of classic and older kind of style of font.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably how those brands generally tend to be not serif fonts.
But then, you touched on it earlier about, creating unique type, and even, creating something from scratch even.
Yeah.
Right? I always remember the Olympics 2012 in the UK.
Okay.
When that type first came out, that logo design, it was using, 2012 in quite an angular sort of cross between a sans serif and a script type font, I guess, which was created, uniquely. So it wasn't using a typeface or anything like that. And I remember the uproar when that first came out. Everybody was like, I hate it, I hate it. But over time, it's one of those kind of designs that, by the use of how the numbers were positioned and in relation to the whole motif that it was created within, over time, people got familiar with it and then they started to love it. So
that's really
I
interesting.
don't know how many brands have done that overtly, it created something. I guess they didn't originally create something that they thought, oh, the public's going to hate.
No.
But how many brands have kind of created a logo design, say, using type, that over time people kind of get, actually, I love that now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's quite clever as well, in fact. Obviously, that's a timed base logo, which is very different to, say, something like Coca-Cola, which I suppose does prove my point wrong of, everything being sans serif. It's kind of a very stylized, almost serif-like font the way it's written, but because it's so iconic and because they want to connotate the heritage, the history, the older feel of where they came from, that's part of their brand and that's part of the selling point. They want to absolutely hold on to that.
Yeah.
So I think if they were to rebrand, it would suggest that, they're not feeling like they're aligned to that font anymore. That old Coca-Cola, that old heritage is gone. And I think that's a really interesting point to make with regards to type and fonts, is what that's saying about the brand.
Yeah.
And like we said about Apple and things like that, once you've changed that, and if you do decide to change that as a brand, it's a big message you're sending out to your audience.
Absolutely.
It's huge. So you've got the older, like you said, you've got the older brands that stand by their guns to say, we want to prove we're trustworthy, we're really worth buying into because we've stood by our logo for this amount of time.
Yeah.
And morally and vision, messaging, mission wise, the brand still feels like they're on the same lines they were before.
They do. But then, you mentioned Coca-Cola, but looking at market share, obviously we're based in the UK, so I know market share now. Pepsi are like eating ground up on Coca-Cola exponentially, and they've taken a different approach, a very sort of modern sans serif font for pretty much everything that they do, and obviously they're trying to tap into younger cohort. So obviously the younger cohort, if they then get brought up on drinking Pepsi, what they're going to do as an adult. Are they going to drink Coke or are they going to drink Pepsi? They're probably more likely to drink Pepsi.
Yeah, that's true.
So in time, I think, just by the use of typography, using a modern sans serif font, I still get it wrong, but sans serif font, they've really started to sell more product. Whereas Coca-Cola in the UK still using the old typography for their logo, and also a lot of their collateral was very sort of traditional looking and warm and cozy and fuzzy kind of feel to it, even like the Christmas ads. I know it's not a typographic ad, but it certainly has that feel of warm and cozy and something familiar. Whereas Pepsi have definitely gone down the route of quite edgy, grungy, aiming at, as I say, the sort of younger cohort from say 14 to 30 age demographic.
Yeah, that's true.
So by using typography in a creative way to align to your brand not just your brand style, but your brand target audience is quite a clever thing to do. And I think, the brands that don't recognize who their target audience is and align the typography to suit, then, potentially it could be detrimental to their brand, really.
Yes, I think that's a really good point that you've made about the Pepsi and Coke conflict. They've always been down each other's necks, essentially. But I think if Coke were to suddenly, go sans serif, it would say a lot about them, and it would look very weak on their part, because it would look like they're trying to align to Pepsi, and they've stood by their guns and said, no, we don't want to change. We are who we are. And I think even that in itself is quite interesting, whereas Pepsi have been quite willing to sort of subtly change their logo, have a go at refining things, tweaking what they've got, and they've always been in that kind of fun bracket.
Yeah.
Whereas I think, like you say, Coca-Cola are trying to retain that classic bracket in the classic market. And I don't think the font is going to hold them back. If they chose like a brand style and a campaign, the font probably wouldn't be holding them back as much as, like you said, their decision to who they're actually targeting at. Whereas Pepsi have gone more fun, more childlike, more teenage-like.
Yeah.
And I think that arguably could be done even with Coca-Cola's branding and their serif font. It's just they've decided to align themselves and stuck by that.
Yeah.
And I think even that's quite admirable, even if it ends up losing the market share, because I think maybe the balance, it might come back round for them.
Could do.
And similarly, other brands, Jack Daniels, those kinds of brands where they've got that classic look, they're not afraid to have a version of their drink or a type of their drink that's a little bit cleaner looking. They'll explore more sans serif fonts, more modern fonts to appeal to the younger market, but they'll keep those classic bottles for the the die-hard fans of Jack Daniels. So I think that's an interesting mix as well, where you've got the core brand behind it, but you've got a division of that brand for a product type, say, or a new range they're releasing, which in the likes of PepsiCo and Coca-Cola they've tried, and really the core fundamental product is still the same. Underneath it all, they've tried the whole zero thing, diet and vanilla, but the bottom line is the core product is really what people are buying, isn't it? You can add as many flourishes to it if you like, but
actually, you touched on Jack Daniels. I mean, that's probably a logo that hasn't changed since it's probably formed back in 18 something or other.
Exactly.
So, and even the design style, again using a serif font.
Yeah.
So that you can tell that by recognition as well. I mean, that's the other thing to kind of bear in mind, that brand recognition, quite often you'll see typography and type being used. So it's the same type style for a lot of their collateral.
Yeah.
So not only type colors and brand colors, but using the same type throughout all their collateral.
Absolutely.
That does aid brand recognition. It builds trust with your target audience.
Looks more
as
professional.
Well. Yeah. So don't underestimate type in that regard.
No, I think, like you said, too quickly these days, because people are using type and they don't fully grasp it or understand it. It's too easy with the tools out there and softwares, having them pre-installed, and the likes of Canva and things online, that people can jump on these tools and not really be fully aware of the fact that they're not using the same fonts, not using the same type. They're actually diluting their brand. So it's, again, being really mindful and really careful that everything you do is consistent, and that the type choice you make is the right one. And you're not just going with a type that looks similar to the other one, or because it's pre-installed on Canva, you can pick it and use it and it will be okay. Because I think over time, like you said, you've got the dilution and you've got the creep, and it might be okay, although we would completely disagree with that, because we'd always try and keep everything branded and consistent. But it might be okay in the eyes of the person doing it, but in 6 to 12 months' time, when they look back and see how far they've drifted away, each time they change the font slightly, that's when it poses a real risk to your brand, because it looks like, to the outside viewer, if you're not concerned about the consistency, then what does that say about the brand as a whole?
Yeah, we call it brand creep, and it does happen with colours With logos, people change their logos. Sometimes they might try and recreate the logo. They might be a supplier of that organization, and change the logo design. And the type, like you say, changing the type it affects the brand. It's massive. But one thing that we can do, like I touched on earlier regarding the spacing of some of the letters and things like that. Just want to touch on that a bit more, about the terminology and things. So if you want to close the gap between the letters, that's a typographic term called kerning. You quite often now in the modern age, a lot of the software, you'll see it is letter spacing basically, but that's essentially what it is.
Yeah.
It's either increasing or decreasing the gap between each letter.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll quite often see, for instance, like space programs, they'll have quite extensive kerning, so there'll be lots of spaces in between the letters. So using kerning effectively can actually, align to a certain sector as well. We touched on the FedEx logo earlier as well, and that's basically taken all the kerning out completely. So all the letters are pretty much bunched up together. In fact, I think some of them might even overlap slightly.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So that's where the kerning can work for you, not just in a logo design, but we tend to use it as well. I'm a big fan of using, like Rob touched on, the Swiss typefaces like Helvetica and the like, the sans serif fonts, where sometimes the kerning out of the box, for headlines, for instance, is quite wide.
Yeah, can be.
So we tend to reduce it by, say, 20%. And that makes it much tighter. Aesthetically, it looks more pleasing.
Yeah.
And it also helps set a style for that brand as well. It looks more refined. So that's kind of kerning in a nutshell.
Yeah, agreed. I don't think there's anything much more to add to that. I would just say probably there are times when really wide kerning is also quite effective in design, usually from our point of view, with capital letters. If you wide kern sentence case, I think there's very few instances where we both thought, oh, that looks really good.
Yeah.
I think it's generally, it's because you've stretched the letters so far away that then the space between each word is then going to have to be even bigger again. And just to read things in that kind of fashion is just not enjoyable for anybody, and it's not how our brains work.
Yeah.
But I think that sort of flips on its head a bit with capitals, because with capitals, like we've said before, the actual the tracing at the top of them, so where the X heights are on the letters, generally with capitals tends to be quite flat along the top, if not always flat. So where you've got lots of copy, it becomes very difficult, tiring, and for some people even impossible to work out what letters are without really struggling.
Yeah.
So generally we'd keep capital letters to a minimum, but where we are writing words, certainly on web, you would use things like accents or labels above titles, and generally they would always be in caps to differentiate them from the lettering below.
Yeah.
And to ensure legibility, because generally they'd be quite small because they're labels or accents, to ensure legibility we would increase the kerning so that when it's scaled down or when it's smaller, you can still really clearly read that. And I think from a personal favourite of our own, when we're doing branding or logos, quite often the subline or the strap line, we would do the same treatment to that.
Yeah.
For the same reason, that when it's scaled down it's legible, but it doesn't dilute the logo, so it looks quite different from the rest of the logo.
Yeah.
I think that's a really effective way of doing that without creating too much problem with the main type.
Yeah. I mean, one of the logos just coming to my mind was Volvo. If you've ever looked at the back of a Volvo, you'll see quite wide kerning on that logo.
Yeah.
Each letter is quite, it's quite a distance.
Very true. Yeah, Land Rover
spread out,
actually, isn't it, as well?
So
that's
where
spaced.
kerning can be quite effective.
Mm.
So another sort of typographic term that we use as well is leading. It's an old typographic term. It comes from the old printing techniques, where they used to have basically set type using basically bits of lead for each of the letters, and they basically have to build a block up to create a sentence. So each letter was basically hand inputted next to each other with space blocks, with basically blank bits of lead in between each word. And then to separate each line, you would then have a piece of lead underneath that, which is basically determining the height of that lead, basically determine how far apart the next sentence was on the line beneath. So, and that's basically where leading came from. And obviously, if you got a very sort of short height with a piece of lead, then that line underneath is going to be much closer to the line above. And so if you want it quite stretched out, you use a taller piece of lead
makes
to
sense.
separate the lines. So that's where it all came about through old printing techniques. But these days, you tend to find that a lot of modern software uses the term line height, basically.
Yeah.
And you can adjust the line height in lots of software now. And we tend to, especially on body text, we tend to make it quite not so tight, so that it becomes easier to read.
Yeah.
Because when type is, like each sentence is butted up next to each other, then quite often it can look, not only aesthetically can look a bit kind of jumbled, but also to the reader becomes more difficult to read.
Yeah, definitely.
So using leading in a nice way, especially in body text, give it a bit more breathing space. Whereas if you're trying to be sort of creating a poster design, let's say, you typically find, like if we're using, as Rob touched on earlier, using all caps, using a sans serif font, for instance, then you'll probably push the leading quite tight, because the more spaced out it just looks aesthetically wrong. So yeah, the good use of typographic techniques using the different elements of the kerning, either increasing or decreasing that, and the same with the leading, can make a big difference to the overall look and effect of type.
Can, especially on mass. If you're looking at magazine styles or magazine layouts, they're very spaced, they're very lots of breathing room, there's columns. From a web point of view, there's, good websites should, because the screens are so big and so wide these days, good websites should try and enforce a max character count again on lines, which again is reflective of that of good books and print logic and things like that. But too often people don't realize, if you've got columns of text or you've got full width text spanning the size of your screen, that people just don't want to read that, and it's actually genuinely tiring your eye out to travel all the way across the screen.
Yeah, it tires me out.
Yeah, exactly. So it's that sort of 67-ish character limit is a good limit to go across to try and have have a maximum limit for a column.
Yeah.
And like you say, that kind of leading and kerning plays a real big role, really, in terms of how easy something is to read. So if like we said earlier, if it's caps, I think you're absolutely right. The spacing can be tighter because the X height is not really there. So you're just traveling across straight lines.
Yeah.
But obviously, when you got sentence case, if you start butting it up too tight to the line above, it's harder for your eye to work out the letters.
Yeah.
And it's just tiring on the eyes. And I think people don't realise necessarily their eyes are getting tired when they're reading it. But our job as designers is to know that that's going to be far more aesthetic to read. And at the end of the day, if someone actually reads it, then it's done its job. Versus a website or a printed poster or some collateral that they see that they don't read, and you think that could be the make or break between whether they've actually engaged with that message. And they don't necessarily know why they don't want to read it, but there'll be reasons behind that, either that, as I say, either it's hard work, it's tiring, or it's just not appealing visually to look at.
I think, that the appeal, the aesthetics is huge in typography. We've seen, especially with a lot of people, not all teams are like this, but some of the in-house teams creating collateral where, they might have been briefed to create, let's say, a poster, for instance. and they're given all this text, and instead of kind of sub-editing and whittling that text down to its bare necessity components, they literally, transpose that onto a poster verbatim, and it might be War and Peace. So you might end up with, a poster with 2,000 blimmin' words on it. And, from an aesthetic, people are just going to switch off. You've got, I think it's a third of a second or something like that to engage with a poster. So if overall that aesthetic of that poster looks very text heavy, and because of the amount of text, you're going to have to reduce the size of the text as well. How appealing is that going to be to the end user? It's not. So what's the result of that? Your message on your poster is going to get missed.
100%.
So
yeah, you're right.
By refining, the key bits of information and whittling it down to probably on a poster, I'd say no more than 100 words, really, if you can get down that low. Then you then got a choice then to have a large heading with then a subheading as more of a descriptor, and then you've got the body text, which is like the information, if you like, and then a call to action. But if you've got 1,000 words or 2,000 or whatever, you've got absolutely no chance to fit all that information in and still make it
right.
eye-catching and informative and effective, really, because ultimately, it comes down to effectiveness. And we've not really touched on this, but the ROI, the return on investment. You can't put War and Peace on, say, a poster, let's say, because the end game is that you want somebody to come to your event or be aware of the information you're trying to portray. Whereas on, say, a website, for instance, especially if it's like a science-based website, and we're doing one for one of our clients, Art Marine, at the moment, and there's a lot of content within that website, and there's areas in it that might need, say, 2,000 words, right? But then we can just do like an introduction piece of text with then a button to say read more or download a data sheet or whatever it might be for somebody that is interested in reading the rest of the information. But to have that, say, on a web page, for instance, that 2,000 words, I mean, you'll probably better to understand how big the page would need to be for that, but it's going to be huge. So there's ways of delivering that kind of information in a pleasing aesthetic way, but also in a way that doesn't alienate some audiences.
No, you're right. Yeah, I mean, we probably even could do a podcast on copywriting alone, to be fair. There's so much you could say about it, but I think you're right in that it comes across a bit lazy as well. So if you've got a very long line and lots of text, it comes across to the viewer quite lazy, like you couldn't really have the time or energy to kind of whittle down the message clearly enough. So why should they spend time reading through it? And I think that's like anything. It's like a good story. It's like a good passage of text. Why is someone's text more interesting than someone else's? And it's usually because they're either a better writer or they've spent time actually thinking about what they're trying to say.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key point, is too often with us, we're having to be that person that spends that time saying, okay, you sent me all this copy and this content for this poster, for this website, or for this message, but actually what is it you're really trying to say, and what do you want the person to do? What's the action, and why are you different than anyone else? Why should they listen to you? And I think that's a really powerful thing, that if you can get that right with typography and combine the two things and get a really powerful message that's succinct, then it's going to hit home 10 times more powerful than someone just ticking a box because they've done that collateral, they've built a website, they've done a poster, but actually they've not really spent the time to work out what it is about them that's different. So that message, for someone that's reading it, they feel like they're going to have to work really hard to try and pull that out because you haven't.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, for me, that's where that comes in, and that's where the value of what we always try and do.
It is.
And assess that comes in.
Yeah. I mean, we do a lot of that, analysing what needs to be said. And we do a lot of discovery sessions with our clients as well, and so we glean a lot of information, and that is part of our job, really, is to refine sometimes quite complex tasks, if you like, or problems that a client might face, and how to promote a product or a service or whatever. And it's our job really to glean as much information as possible and then refine that into, let's say it is, a poster or a social post. That information has got to be very concise, so that level of refinement, that whole process, it can be done internally if you're a client sending us information, but more often than not, a lot of clients come to us and we do the refinement.
Yeah.
But ultimately, a point I was trying to make is ultimately it's, the aesthetic of the piece of collateral becomes much more concise. It's easier for the end user to digest, and therefore is going to gain a bit more traction, with the call to action, whatever that is, more likes, more clicks, pick up the phone, sell services, buy products, whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of the different types of typography now, and the different fonts that you might want to use, where you might use them, how you might use them. We haven't really said any examples of them particularly specifically in terms of what we feel each have done well. So like what you've just said there, I think from a branding point of view, say a brand like Brewdog, for example, they've kept things very simple. I don't particularly like them or believe in them myself, but I do appreciate what they've done. I think they've created that kind of grungy, sort of off-the-wall type brand style. They've kept typography very clean and very minimal, but what they have done is kept the messages very succinct and very easy to read. So like we were just saying then, for someone that walks past, the message is very clear, a bit like Apple would do. Very limited words, but very clear message. And I think that, combined with a strong aesthetic, is really powerful in typography, and it conveys a really strong message. It shows confidence in that we don't need to say very much. We're only picking a few words, and that's our decision to kind of advertise our whole product. It's just to use a couple of words, and I think it exudes confidence. Probably looks quite cocky in the terms of Brewdog's instance, but it's worked for them. They have grown and they have created a lot of momentum, and they did shake the industry up with it. And as I say, I don't personally believe in their morals, but I do appreciate from a brand point of view, I do appreciate what they've done with that, and the use of a serif font. But because it's quite almost slightly condensed and slightly squashed up, it's created that kind of almost like sort of post-punk, sort of grungy type aesthetic to it. And I think that's really clever in itself, that you can create that effect with just a minimal treatment to type.
Well, it's like Lush, the bath bombs and all that kind of thing. They started off with, well, I don't know if they started off with it, but I certainly remember the old branding where they had quite a shouty logo and
green
the type
and yellow,
grew.
I think.
So this is like, what we're talking about earlier about, taking a type style and manipulating it is almost like a megaphone, and it kind of, each letter kind of grew in size, creating the word Lush.
Yeah.
Whereas now they've gone much more contemporary. And again, this is like we touched on earlier about how brands evolve, and looking at their target audiences, probably the products that they sell and whether that's changed over time. But now, they've got a very sort of clean looking sans serif font, all in uppercase, and it's very, it looks aesthetically really pleasing. It probably now aligns to their either an evolved target audience or a new target audience.
It's very true.
Probably evolved, I would have said, because people have probably grown up with that brand for the last 20, 30 years or however long they've been going. But yeah, so that's one of the brands that I've seen. It's quite a marked difference between their old branding to what it looks like now. Just a nicer use of type, but doing kind of less with their new branding, with a new logo,
you're right,
than they did before.
It's very interesting. So we were saying earlier about brands that don't need to change much. They don't need to refine their kind of main image, their logo, their motif. They don't need to do a lot to that to maintain that consistency. But I think you're right that Lush is a really good example where they've obviously seen the need to do that, and they've identified it and done it, and that's come across really positively, because people that maybe weren't resonating with their older branding, which was right at the time of when they did it, and now perhaps comes across quite garish, quite brash. It's quite old school. The colours of like green and yellow together are quite in your face.
Yeah.
Whereas now everything's very environmentally conscious. Certainly soap-based things, you need to be very careful that you're telling people that you're using the right things, they're coming from the right places, they've not got loads of chemicals in them. So I think having that kind of garishy type look and feel, they positively changed it, and it shows the audience that they're aware of that and they've made that adjustment as a brand.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting way of using quite similar type, but changing it subtly.
Yeah, be interesting to know like what they did in terms of their, background research and what prompted the change.
Yeah, it would.
And it'd be interesting to know if anybody knows that. Put it in the comments.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting rebrand, that one.
But then you got the likes of, say, Selfridges. And as far as I'm aware, I mean, I don't think they've changed their logo for quite some time.
Not that I'm aware.
They've used quite a narrow font, and the Selfridges being in the black, and if I remember the background being yellow.
Yeah.
And they've also put a little co or and co, so a nod to obviously their heritage. And so, they kept that very clean and succinct. They haven't really messed around with the type too much.
No, they haven't
either.
at all, no.
So that's a really nice example of a very clean sans serif font that, you can instantly recognize, partly because of the colorization of how they've treated the type with the background block of yellow, but also the type itself.
Yeah, the type itself's really interesting because it's quite stylized, and again, it's quite condensed. But like we said with Brewdog, probably a little bit more condensed than Brewdog. But they've created that balance with essentially a monotonic color, similar to the branding we've established with Whitespace, where we've got that kind of quite strong block type, but we would apply a color behind it. And I think Selfridges, by using, which we haven't discussed a lot actually, but an outline version of quite a bold font, you create quite a strong contrast.
Yeah.
So you don't have to change the color, the weight, anything else in the font, just the outline immediately creates that contrast between the name and the and co bit, like you said. But then that strong use of yellow means that the majority of their brand can be carried by one color.
Yeah.
Because the identity is so bold and blocky that the color itself just creates that whole personality for it. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
It's not actually the typography that's creating because without the yellow, the typography would be quite bland on its own.
Yeah.
But that mix of a really strong color just gives it so much personality.
Yeah.
And I think that's, again, really interesting and really poignant at how one color can make such a difference.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely adds to the brand. I mean, look at Coca-Cola. I mean, more often than not, you see, the Coca-Cola logo in red, and the kind of really nice, almost Ferrari-esque red.
Yeah, I suppose it is. Yeah, they probably would,
but they probably won't thank me for that. No. But yeah, so it's quite iconic. So some type, in combination, like you say, with the colours. Brand recognition, you can spot it a mile off.
Yeah.
And I think you can't underestimate the effectiveness of colour with type as well, especially on the logo design.
Absolutely not. And we struggle with that when we're trying to portray a new brand image or a rebrand or logos to clients. When you try and show them, if you stick a palette on there, immediately they're going to fixate on all the different colours, all the palettes, how it mixes. But then if you show it monocolour with just black and white, sometimes that identity can come across, certainly to someone that's not trained in design or seeing designs, come across quite heavy to them. They don't fully understand it in the way that we would immediately see it and go, well, we know that's monotone, we know it's cut out, we know how it could look with colours. A client or somebody that's viewing it that doesn't know that would see it and go, well, that's really dark, that's really harsh, that's really strong.
Yeah.
And once you add the colour in, their opinion completely changes. But it's very difficult to show. Colour has such an impact on the type. It's very difficult to show it and not have that person fixate on it. Yeah,
like you say, I mean, it's for us doing our job, it is very difficult. We 99% of the time design our logos in black and white to present to the client initially, because like you say, they do quite often fixate on the colour, or I don't like green, or why have you done it red? We don't use red. It's so we want to kind of eliminate that But then conversely, the downside is sometimes they might not really see the potential of a logo design because it's not in a
Exactly that.
specific color.
Exactly that.
So, we've had it from both sides, really.
Yeah. Yeah, the compromise is to try and show them probably the majority of them black and white, but some examples where
Yeah,
we
yeah.
have used colour to show how it could work, but very strongly stressing do not fixate on the colours, even though half the time they still will. But yeah, a little bit of a sort of divergence there, but that's essentially us trying to communicate, I think, the purpose of colour in a strong brand,
Yeah, yeah.
and it plays a big role.
Going back to type treatment, I remember and talking about brands that we like actually.
Yeah.
Tate Modern.
Yeah.
They created a logo initially. I don't know if it's their initial logo, but I certainly remember one iteration of their logo where it looked like blurred.
Yes, that was the original one, wasn't it?
And so that had a connotation of like, oh, what is that? And
Yeah.
from a distance, obviously it doesn't look blurred,
No.
but obviously close up it does. And that was done in like a kind of solid way as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Whereas now they've kind of used almost harking back to well, even the old poster styles.
Yeah, like Warhol style type stuff.
Warhol,
Yeah.
type styles where they're using halftone dots
Yeah.
to create this new identity.
Yeah.
So it still aesthetically looks very similar to the old identity. It's
It
just
does.
a different type treatment.
Yeah.
But the overall effect hasn't really changed.
No.
And I think that's a really nice thing to do as well.
It's really clever.
Yeah.
Yeah, really clever. And it also creates, like I said, for me, it creates like the kind of connotation to almost like a map like style where it's showing the broad spectrum of the brand and how widespread it is now and how different cultures, different communities coming
Yeah.
in. That subtleness of that kind of halftone, like you say, almost looks like sort of points on a map, and I think that's really clever
it
as well.
does.
It creates that kind of holistic approach
Yeah.
of everyone's included.
And they'll probably say that it's also to do with the different styles of
Yes,
art
exactly.
within
Cultures, styles.
creative culture and all this kind of
Clever.
stuff.
Very
It is
clever.
clever.
Very clever.
Yeah. I mean, another kind of logo that I really like as well, and I know you do too, is the Unilever
Yeah.
logo,
Yeah.
where again this is using type in a very clever and creative way. Which Unilever has type underneath its motif, but the motif itself is a letter U, an uppercase, but it's not a solid letter. It's not a sans serif or anything like that. It's basically the use of very small illustrations and very tightly packed together to create the shape of the letter U.
Really
And
clever.
I think that's it's genius, really.
Yeah.
So you can kind of tell a story with some of the illustrations that are within that letter U. So when you see it large, which sometimes they do on promotional items and the like, you kind of get the sense of what the look and the feel and all the illustrations, and it kind of tells a story. Whereas, quite often when you pick up a product, it's normally on the back of the label.
Yeah,
and
tiny.
It's really tiny,
Yeah.
and you can't really work out what it is.
No,
But
you can't.
so you're not really being told a story there.
No.
But the overall effect is you still identify that is the Unilever logo, and the type basically has been constructed in a way that you can instantly recognise that it is Unilever.
Yeah, it's very clever, and the use of almost like a script type style, which is very unusual, but yet it's quite timeless in itself. They've kept that for quite a while.
Yeah.
And I think that's, harking back to what we said earlier, that's quite a rare use of that, I think, for a brand that wants to maintain that consistency.
Yeah.
It's safer to go with the sans serif or something blockier.
Yeah.
They've taken a bit of a bold move with that. But like you say, it's that multi-engagement level they've created, I think, which sometimes you don't see. If you see a brand, you've seen it, that's it. You're not going to get anything more from it. But the fact that when you see it small, you don't fully understand until you see it bigger quite how much they put into the U and how much intelligence has gone into that. I think that is really clever, given the amount of spectrum of products that they're on.
Yeah.
That's a really nice.
Yeah, and also it's a level of refinement that again, people that obviously in the know will appreciate the kind of
Yeah.
level of complexity and detail that has gone into creating that identity.
Yeah.
And we do the same thing, with our agency. We try and create, especially on the logo side of things, very unique looking identities. Some of which go on, if the client demands it, or we advise it and then they accept it. We go on to register the logo, and that's another area that we've not touched on, but to try and trademark your identity, your logo design.
Yeah.
The more unique it is, the more likely it is to be accepted for a trademark.
Yeah. That's very true. So another brand that I noticed before this podcast, obviously that stood out to me that I quite liked was Oatly, because they've used quite a sans serif font, but they've used it in quite a good example of sort of quite a playful way. So it's almost like a semi-stamped like appearance. But again, we were talking about ligatures earlier, so they've played with some of the ligatures, they've smoothed off some of the corners and added a subtle connotation of like a grain in there of oat. So you've got that kind of very fun, friendly kind of brand aesthetic, but yet there's still it's harking back to a modification of a sans serif font, and that's carrying it, and then the subtle things like the coloration of oat with Lee, it just creates quite a fun brand. And I think because of the market they were trying to get in, there's a lot of dairy users out there, a lot of dairy drinkers. They're trying to break the market if you don't have to be intolerant to it to actually try it and still enjoy their brands. And obviously they've expanded now into all sorts of different oat products. But I think that kind of the way they approached that and the way they came on board with that kind of very initial look and feel, very strongly type-based, I think was a really good way of doing that.
Yeah, it sets the tone for the brand and aligns to their target audience.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely. But I mean, on the Oatly or logo specifically, there's, like you say, where that grain of oats is. It's a good use of kind of using the negative space within the A. It's basically like a triangle, if you like, and it's got where you'd normally see the cut out bits of the letter A. That isn't there. Basically, it's just like a solid triangle, but they've created that cut out bit using the oat shape.
Yeah.
And we've not really touched on this, but there are clever logo designs out there where they have cut out elements, excuse me, cut out elements of letters using the negative space.
Absolutely,
to create, different styles of letters and logo designs. Blueberry is one that comes to mind if you check that out. That's got like a leaf and the sort of blueberry leaf, with a little berry and things coming into the letter B. The B is basically like a solid block B with this nice illustration inside of it. And it's a really nice logo. So the clever use of negative space as well.
It's almost combining a motif with the letter forms, isn't it? So you're not having a separate motif, you're combining it in with the letter, which is very clever in itself.
Yeah.
And you're right, we haven't talked about even deconstruction of type, but that's really clever, where you can take away quite a lot of the typeface or of the font, and somebody can still understand, still digest, still engage with what that message is through the way the brain works and reads letters and reads type. But actually there's very little of the type, very little information there for them to actually take on board. So I think that's, again, a really strong use of how you can do things with type. You can deconstruct it, you can play around with it, and still it's a very effective communicator.
Exactly.
Cool. So I think we've pretty much covered most things then on type. Been pretty comprehensive. Hopefully not gone too far, too overboard with some things. Let us know what you think, and if there's, like Paul said, if there's any comments or additions to anything we've mentioned, or examples of some of the questions you posed earlier, then we'd definitely be grateful to hear that. But yeah, other than that, I think that's pretty much wraps this one up.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think if you can like our posts and make any comments and subscribe to our YouTube channel, be most welcome.
Eternally grateful. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, guys. Well, thanks for that, and we'll see you on the next one.
See you soon.